But today we have Gillian Murphy here from University College Cork, and she's going to talk about her research around false memory related to the abortion referendum here not so long ago. Gillian collaborates with Elizabeth in the US and with Kira here on this research as well. So lots of links to ECG, so I'll let you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Michelle. Delighted to be here, and I'm really sorry that we're late. We went for lunch and mistimed the ordering the taxi situation on the way back. Okay, so I'm going to, as Michelle said, talk about some false memory research related to the abortion referendum in May. Obviously this work involves Beth and Kira and some others that I'll maybe mention as we go along. So this is actually a big project. We're looking at lots of different things. It's kind of a big longitudinal study across 12 months, looking at people and how they feel and how they remember the abortion referendum. So I'm mostly going to talk about the first study, and then at the end I might just talk a little bit about our ongoing studies that I think are kind of cool, but we haven't got tons of data for them yet. So to start with, we talk about fake news. People talk about fake news kind of generally as a problem, and people throw around this term all the time. But it's kind of interesting from a cognitive psychology perspective, because there's so much misinformation and there's so much misleading information and biased information that it's interesting to cognitive psychologists to study the effects on memory and how people can experience and remember events kind of differently depending on the information that they're exposed to. So we thought it'd be interesting to study this kind of in a political context. But before we get to that, just have to cover some theory before we get into it. So we might just talk quickly about the source monitoring framework, because this just kind of underpins what we did. I think the best way to explain this is to, if all of you could imagine for me, if you kind of maybe close your eyes and have a think, and imagine you're in the pub and you met Bono. And just think, you're in a pub, you're with your friends, you met Bono, and he bought you all a round of drinks. And maybe think about what that might have been like, and how that might have unfolded. And picture that in your mind, and imagine you've thought about it for a while. And then I come along and I ask you, did you really meet Bono, or did you just think about meeting Bono? And the idea behind the source monitoring framework is that when you recall that image or that experience of meeting Bono, there's not a tag attached to that says this is real or this is not real. That's not the way it's stored. It's actually up to you. It's up to the rememberer to decide if something is a real memory or not a real memory, is the basic concept. And so the idea is that you make this series of kind of rapid judgments. You assess the image and the memory in your mind, and you decide if it's real or not. And the first type would be kind of the heuristic judgment. And so you think about your experience with Bono and you assess all the different qualities of that memory. So how easily does it come to mind? Is it vivid? Is it detailed? You know, who was with you? What were you wearing? What did he smell like? Anything at all you want to think about the experience. And the more details you have for that, the more real it's going to seem. And you think, okay, that's probably a real memory. And then there's also the systematic judgment. So you also think about your kind of previous knowledge. You think, what else? So the systematic judgment, you think, what else do I know about Bono? So you think, okay, my memory is that he was really nice and he bought us drinks, but is that in line with what I think about Bono? Or the reverse, you know, he was awful to me. Is that what I really already think about Bono? And so you think about, you know, does this make sense? Does this seem like something that would be true? Do I go to bars? Do I drink? Is this something that kind of seems sensible? And so if you take this perspective on false memory research, you can understand ways in which if you think about ways in which you can kind of bias these two judgments. So if we want to bias the kind of heuristic judgment, if we want to make you believe something is true when it isn't, we might try to make sure that you have lots of information about a subject. So, you know, the more often you go to bars, the more often you've met people and had drinks, the more often you've had those experiences, you've got kind of more raw information to kind of draw from. It makes it easier to build up that kind of memory. We could also doctor images, we could give you deepfake videos, anything that might help you kind of to make it easier to picture it. That's going to make you more likely to have a false memory. And then the second one about systematic judgment. If we kind of give you something that is in line with your existing beliefs, it makes sense that would also be easier to kind of form a false memory for that. So again, if you're the chief member of Bono's fan club, and I tell you, remember the time you met Bono and he was really, really nice, that might be easier for you to kind of form a memory for it, because it's a false memory for it, because it's in line with things that you already believe, is kind of the basic idea. And so there's been lots of research that has kind of assessed these ideas, and they generally hold up. So we know that we can get people to form rich false memories about things that didn't happen. So the lost in the mall paradigm, it's ridiculous to talk about this. So the lost in the mall paradigm, I'm just going to keep pointing at you every time I talk about anything, where just asking people to remember this traumatic event, kind of traumatic, you'll get about 25% of people to build a rich memory and to say, yeah, I remember this, and even add in details about things that didn't happen. So we know we can do that. And then we also know that that we can we can maybe make predictions about who will be most likely to fall for these. So we know in general we can create false memories, but using this framework we can predict maybe who would be most likely to form them. And so the study that Beth mentioned last night, where people are shown either a fake story about George Bush going on holiday during Hurricane Katrina, or they're shown Barack Obama shaking hands with the president of Iran. And both groups thought that was a bad thing. Both conservatives and liberals think, well, that's not a good thing. But say if you're a liberal, you don't like George Bush and you don't like the behaviour. And so there's a nice kind of congruency there with those two things. And again, it just makes it easier. It makes you kind of more likely to be able to kind of build that memory. And I'm trying to remember what else was in the slides.
We're getting a new laptop here.
Right, yeah, it's all coming together. And then the other one. So Kira did a study when she was in UCC that looked at how much people know about a topic. And so they gave people 7 topics like science, football, politics, things like that. And you could just say which one you were most interested in and which one you were least interested in. And maybe off the top of your head you might think, so people here, if anyone really hates soccer, versus those who love soccer, you would think the people who know nothing about soccer are going to have more false memories for soccer, because you think, I don't know anything, I don't care, I'll form a false memory. Whereas in actual fact it's the opposite. So the people who are really interested in soccer, who know loads about it, who follow it, they're the people who are most likely to form false memories for a soccer event. And it sounds weird, but I think once you unpack it, it makes a lot of sense, because the more you know about a subject, I kind of think of it as having more raw materials with which to build a memory. So if you ask me about something that happened in my office, I could think of lots of times I've been in my office, lots of things that have happened in my office. It's easy to kind of build something. Whereas you ask me about something that happened in, I don't know, Shanghai, and I'd say I've never been to Shanghai, and I can't even begin to kind of build that or to picture what that would look like. Anyway, and so basically when you put all those things together, you would think people would form false memories. We think people can form these rich false memories for things that didn't happen. That's kind of the first thing. We think people who know a lot about it would be most likely to form a false memory about this thing. And we think that people will form false memories in line with their beliefs. You can tend to form something in line with your pre-existing attitudes, your pre-existing biases, is the basic idea. And so a couple of years ago, I had a really great undergraduate student, Stephen O'Neill, and he did a project looking at false memories for the marriage equality referendum here. And what's key here is that the referendum happened in May 2015, and he did the study in January 2017. And I'll show you in a minute, he showed people some true stories and some fake stories. And so he showed people some true events and some fake events. And this is the same paradigm that we're going to use in the study that we're going to talk about, where we show people a story and we say, do you remember this? And we give them lots of options to kind of qualify their memory. So they can say, I remember this happening, or they can say, they can say, I remember hearing about this, sorry is the first one, or I remember seeing this. They can say, I don't remember seeing or hearing this, but I do remember it happening. Or they can say, I remember this differently, or I don't remember it at all. And so you can kind of get a bit of a scale of kind of, if you remember I'll just skip over some of these. We showed people kind of different events. So we showed them a true event. So this is a true event, just talking about how the gay marriage referendum, the result made international headlines. This is just very simple. We showed them some very detailed events, some kind of very general ones like this. And so, do you remember when this happened? And then we showed them 4 fabricated events. I haven't got time to talk about all of them, but this is one of them. So we came up with these based very much on the George Bush, Barack Obama thing. We thought, okay, what do people think about the other side, and how can we play on that and kind of create a false event that will tap into that. And so if you remember this mural that went up in the centre of Dublin, it actually just rained and it damaged it. So no one vandalised this, there was no damage, and we described it as a deliberate act of vandalism, that someone tried to damage it. And lots of people remembered this thing going up, and lots of people fell for this. They said, yeah, this was outrageous, and I was so mad. This was the day I decided to start canvassing. Like, people had crazy memories for this, which was great.
Quick question, Gillian. Is in this work, is there an insinuation that the story is real? Did you happen to see or remember it?
So I forgot to mention
that insinuation.
We very much like, if I didn't put it here, but we usually open with kind of all we want to know is. We'll give it some kind of ruse. So in this study, we said we're interested in changing perspectives over time. And we just said, we're going to show you some events, and we asked them, did they remember it? And then we gave them 2 open response boxes, and we pretended that's what we were interested in. So we said, how did you feel at the time, and how do you feel now? And made them think, it was about change. And so people were more focused on telling us about their evolving perspective than necessarily kind of catching them out or making them remember. And so that's what we hoped we would see this political orientation effect. We thought, okay, this is the kind of story that if you voted yes, you're more likely to believe this. It makes the no side look bad. And we thought we did a great job, but it didn't work. So I'll show you the true stories. This is just an example. 90% remember this about it making international headlines. But one thing we started to see in the qualitative responses was this really balanced kind of, even in the people who I would say were on the far extremes, who said things like disappointed for the lack of truth and honesty, this was a no voter, but I suppose some happiness for gay people who felt pleased, even though I knew it was misplaced. So this hodgepodge, this other person who voted no, said I accepted it, I knew it would pass, possibly thankful that my prejudices didn't stop someone else from living their life. There were loads of responses like this, which it begs belief that someone would vote no and then say this. But we saw a lot of this. And then we also saw it with the fake stories. So in general, people did report that they remembered events that didn't happen, so that kind of hypothesis held up. But, so 44% remember this event that didn't happen. We saw all these kind of balanced kind of reflections on what happened. So a yes supporter saying, I disagree with the vandalism, but if the tables were turned, we'd be just as bad. And people said things like, yeah, if there was a large pro-no, some people said, I'd probably vandalise it too if it was the other side. No supporter, this person said, on one level it is free speech, but I find it repulsive. So you're seeing people able to hold really 2 opinions at once and able to kind of have this balanced perspective. And so, maybe unsurprisingly, we saw no effect of political orientation. So I haven't explained the other 3 fake events, but basically we expected yes supporters to believe these 2 more than the no supporters, and the no on the other 2, and you see they're almost exactly the same. And so I went to visit Beth, and I was telling her about this study, and I think members of your lab group were kind of saying, wow, are Irish voters just so evolved? This didn't happen to them. And I was like, no, I was like, you weren't there, it was bad. And everyone thought, okay, what could be going on? And so the other thing we did find, it did support the subject knowledge effect, which is similar to Kira's work, in that the more true memories people had, the more false memories they had. So that was nice that held up. And people did form false memories, just not in the direction that we maybe expected them to form them. And so we were left with these kind of outstanding questions. So we knew we had the subject knowledge effect, where people who were more invested in a campaign were more susceptible to forming false memories. But we didn't get this effect of political orientation, which was really what we were interested to begin with. And myself and Stephen spent a long time trying to understand why we weren't seeing this effect that we expected. We wondered maybe it was the nature of the issue. Something like gay marriage, it prompts a lot of complex feelings and a kind of a complex moral decision, and we thought maybe it's just so complicated. It's not as simple as I'm Republican or I'm liberal, and we thought maybe that was it. We thought about cultural differences. Maybe Irish voters are just different. We have very different media, it's not as partisan. We have a legal requirement for balance on both sides. Maybe that could be driving the kind of lack of effect. Maybe it was just the stories. Maybe we didn't kind of tap into the right thing with our fake stories. We thought a lot about how, for a lot of people, being pro or anti-gay marriage, it only emerged as an issue maybe a few weeks before the referendum itself, or a few months. They hadn't lived their lives thinking, I am pro or I am anti. It maybe wasn't integral to people's identity, which might be kind of important in this. Whereas Republicans and Democrats, you have Republican states, you have Democratic states and families and news agencies and things like that. It's much more kind of easy to delineate. we had a bit of low power, especially for no voters. We had about 600 participants altogether and only about 10% no voters. We just couldn't get them. So that was an issue, and we had a very highly educated sample. So once we unpacked all of it, we thought, there's a few issues here. It was mostly university staff and students, and we wondered, would you get these balanced responses from everyone, or was it just kind of academics? And so we were left with this question as to whether or not these effects might be evident during a similarly emotional referendum campaign. And then about a year ago, the Taoiseach announced we would have a referendum on abortion, of all things. And so I contacted Beth and I said, this looks like it's going to be a great opportunity to look at a lot of these factors. So to get a bigger sample, most people kind of know if they're pro-choice or pro-life. If you're on either side, you've thought about it before. This issue has been brewing in Ireland for a long time, and a lot of people might see it as more directly relevant to their own lives. You could maybe make that argument for some people. And we could maybe get a big sample. So we saw it as a good opportunity. And so this is the study that we're going to talk about. And so it's a collaboration with Ciara and Beth, and also Becky, who is Beth's grad student in University of California, Irvine, and Professor Linda Levine, who's from Irvine as well. And if you all remember, if you cast your minds back, the referendum in May was to repeal the 8th Amendment and allow the government to legislate for abortion rights. And so we wanted to examine the role of political orientation, as I mentioned, campaign knowledge, so how much they knew about the campaign just in general, this idea of kind of subject knowledge, and also verbal ability. So we kind of just got a bit more interested in individual differences. We started wondering, was it an effective education? Would we see it in everyone? So we decided to measure cognitive ability in this as well, so that we might be able to see if there's people who are particularly susceptible. And so we paired up with the journal. They decided to run the article with embarrassingly large pictures of me and Ciara that I put out. They were really great, so we paired up with them, and they, again, we needed a bit of a ruse. You can't tell people you're studying false memories, obviously. So we said, did the media influence your vote in the referendum? You'll note it has 50 comments, not one is about our study. Not one. We were watching the comments roll in, expecting people to give away our study, or no, nothing. It's just people ranting about the media.
Referendum having nothing to do with the media.
Nothing at all, or like bloody academics, or it was nothing. And so we did this a week prior to polling day, and so it was great. It allowed us to kind of maybe connect with a broader sample of people, as well as plaguing anyone who opened Twitter for a couple of weeks. And then just briefly, in terms of the method, we measured people, kind of demographic factors, and then lots of kind of political opinions, how they felt about the referendum, how much they had read about it, all sorts of things that I'll get to as we kind of move along. And then we showed them news stories. So everyone saw 6 news stories. They saw 4 true stories from the campaign, and they saw 2 fabricated stories. And we wrestled a lot with the ethics of this, because it is in a real world campaign, and we gave a lot of thought to what kind of fake information we could give people. We didn't want to sway anyone's vote. And so we took a few steps. So we made a very careful balance of stories that were about the yes side and about the no side, kind of good and bad for each side. So everyone, no matter what condition they were in, they saw an even balance of yes and no stories. And then we were trying to decide what fabricated information to give them. And it would have been tempting, if you remember, if you cast your minds back to May, there was lots of misinformation around about what kind of legislation was going to follow the referendum. Abortion will be legal up to birth. It will be paid for by your taxes. There was all sorts of things kicking around, and maybe it was tempting to look at those things. It would have been nice to see if we could kind of spread misinformation about that, but we felt that wasn't ethically okay, because that really would impact how someone might vote. So instead, we just kind of went with kind of very small-ish stories about kind of a campaigner said this thing, or a politician said this thing. And we thought that was small enough that it doesn't relate to the wider issue, it doesn't relate to the actual impact of your vote, what's going to happen. And obviously, I'll show you in a minute, we went to long lengths to debrief people comprehensively to make sure they didn't leave the study thinking that any of this was true. So we did spend a lot of time trying to get that right. And so after they'd seen the stories, we then told them, we said some people who took this study were shown some fake news stories, and we specified they were completely fabricated by the researchers. So not fake news in the sense that things that are untrue that like a politician said, but we made them up. And we said, can you select any stories you think were fake from the list below? And we showed them all 6 of them again and said you can pick some. Most people picked at least 1, some people picked 6. People were highly suspicious, which I'll get to in a second. And then they had an optional word sum vocabulary test. This is a 10-item test of verbal ability. And the reason we made it optional is that we really wanted to recruit as many people as we could, and people who maybe weren't used to doing surveys, who would find this very long already. We wanted to get as many people to the end as we could, and then we said, if you have time, can you answer these other questions? And there was an even number of yes and no voters who did continue. About 70% of people, I think, did continue and do the test. But it meant that we retained everyone else who was already sick of the survey. And so it looked a bit like this. We present a picture, a summary of the story. This is a true story. So this was about GAA stars who were campaigning for a no vote. And as you see, we asked people, do you remember this event? He said, I remember seeing or hearing this. I don't remember seeing or hearing this, but I remember it happening. This is new, we added this in. So this hadn't been in other studies before, but we said, I don't have a specific memory of this, but I believe that it happened. Because there's been a bit of an argument in the false memory world about whether people are really remembering something or they just find it plausible. So if you found that you kind of thought something probably did happen, if you didn't have this option, you might go for this, or you might go for one of them. You might not be sure where to kind of place yourself. And so we thought we'll put this in so people can specifically say, I don't remember it, I just think it's plausible, which we thought was important. And then this is just an example of kind of, half of the people saw athletes for no, half of them saw actors for yes. So we kind of gave this balance as to what people were seeing across them. So it's just another example. And then the fake stories that we gave people. So everyone saw two fake stories, one about the yes side, one about the no side. And so everyone saw one of these poster stories. This is a fake story, and we thought this was kind of neat to be able to show people the exact same story. So it says that either the yes or the no campaign had to destroy 25,000 campaign posters after it emerged that they bought them with foreign money, either with American pro-choice lobbyist money or American pro-life lobbyist money. And we thought it was neat because it's obviously the exact same story, which is, you're not dealing with other confounding effects. We felt that there was enough truth in both of them for both campaigns that people might kind of fall for them. So if you remember, Amnesty International got some money from George Soros and they were ordered to return it, and they were using that money to call for a referendum. And the No campaign were accused of using foreign money for Facebook ads. So we felt for both of them there was maybe a grain of truth or a grain of suspicion, but neither of these happened. So no one had to destroy any posters at any point. No one was kind of even found guilty, say, of accepting this money. So we felt it was kind of a good way to look at the effect of bias. And then the other story we wanted to use, we tried to think of something that would get people quite emotional, that would get an emotional response and really kind of rile them up. So we thought, okay, what's a terrible thing that someone could have said? And we, at the time, the Ulster rugby players' sexual assault trial was on. Everyone was talking about it, and we thought this would be a good thing to kind of tap into. So we said that either someone from the yes side had said something very inflammatory, linking the referendum to the trial, or that someone on the no side had said something equally inflammatory. And the idea with this, it was different to the first story. We wanted to tap into existing stereotypes. So the stereotype that the yes side were kind of dramatic, militant feminists who were overblowing the impact of the 8th Amendment, and that the no side were misogynists and they didn't trust women. So we kind of thought we'll try and directly tap into those two and see if that works better than something general. But what we didn't see coming, and we should have seen coming in retrospect, is that this criminal trial was like a red mist that descended on people. As soon as we mentioned the trial, people ignored the entire story about the comments and just told us how they felt about the trial. So I agreed with the verdict, but disagreed with the WhatsApp messages. Those lads' careers are ruined. She wasn't as innocent as she was made out to be. Like, endless. People just read the first 2 lines of those stories and said, here is how I feel about this. And not everyone gave us a qualitative response. So we had lots of people who had ticked, I remember this, and then written nothing. And we were left in a position of not really knowing if they remember the trial, like these people, or they remember the fake event. And we felt we couldn't fairly interpret it. So we basically left it out of the rest of the analysis. It's interesting for lots of reasons. Some of the responses are horrendous, but it's not really for our purposes. We thought we couldn't trust it. So I'm not going to talk about this anymore, just the poster stories for the rest of it. In terms of the participants we had, so we had 3,140 actually finished everything. We had maybe another 1,500 who skipped parts of it and things like that. We had far more yes voters than no voters. We only had about 12% no voters, despite trying our best to get more of them. see there's lots of information here, but in general, if you just look between yes and no voters, so we also had people who said they were unsure, or people who said they couldn't vote, or people who just didn't tell us how they were going to vote. They didn't have to. And you'll see that yes voters in general were more likely to be female, they were more likely to be younger. They obviously identified more as pro-choice, and they identified more as liberal. But other than that, they were very, very similar. So no difference on cognitive ability, education, how important they reported the referendum was to them. None of those kind of key things that we were kind of concerned about showed up as any different between yes and no voters. So some of the analysis we were able to leave in everyone, but any of the political orientation stuff we could only keep people who reported being a yes or a no voter. So in terms of the results, most of the time when I say that this many people remembered or didn't remember, I've collapsed the responses down. So when people say, I have a specific memory, or not a specific memory, but I remember it happening, that counts as remember. When they say I don't remember it, or I remember it differently, that is, they don't remember. And when people said I believe this happened, most of the time we just excluded it. We felt it was kind of a fair way to give a conservative estimate. When someone says I believe it happened, they're kind of neither remembering it nor saying it didn't happen. They're kind of in the middle. And so we used it for some of the analyses, but in general we just left these people out, just to kind of be as conservative as we could. In terms of the true events, people remembered on average like 2.2 out of a possible 4. So people kind of did okay. Some people remembered all 4, some people remembered none. I haven't really got time to talk you through all of the true events. These are all true stories, if you remember. The one thing I want to point out is that almost all of them have significant differences between yes and no voters. So people's memories of things that genuinely did happen are a bit different, and they're different really in the way that we expected. So these, there were 8 stories altogether. These 6 were ones we expected to see a difference in. It made the yes side look bad or the no side look bad, and so we expected that. So if you see the actors for yes, yes voters are more likely to remember it. The GA players for no, that's not quite significant, but the no voters are more likely to remember it. The Ronan Mullen accusing the 8th committee of bias, you can see no voters more likely to remember it. So kind of exactly as we expected. And it made us feel a bit better about, we did okay with the balance of yes and no stories, because literally half of them were remembered more by the yes side and half remembered more by the no side. So that was kind of comforting. And there were 2 more that we just kind of put them in as neutral stories. So this was about people with graphic images outside hospitals, and the story was that both sides had condemned this, and there was no difference in who remembered it. And then Simon Coveney changing his mind. We couldn't agree on whether that was good for the yes or the no side, and neither did the people who took part. So most people just kind of remembered it happening. They gave long responses about how they felt about him, but no specific effect on that. And then one thing I want to mention before I show you the results for the fake stories is, if you can cast your mind back to a week before the referendum, if you remember everything people saw online, they were suspicious of. So suspicious of everything. Everything was a ploy, everything was biased, everything was a trick. And there was a lot of this in the responses. So both ways, people accusing us of being biased on both sides. Is this a no campaign scam? Are you working for the yes side? A lot of this. People just deeply suspicious of everything. A lot of people telling me my dissertation was bad. You don't understand survey methodology. Some of them got cut out, but there was lots of people saying, I know a lot about surveys and this is a terrible survey and it's too biased. But people argued about bias on both sides, which is the best we could have done, I think. And what's interesting is that despite this suspicion, people did form a lot of false memories. So altogether, 48% remembered at least one of the 2 fabricated events that they were shown. Mostly people reported a specific memory, 11% more general, and then when you add in the memory or the belief, you've got 63% remembering or believing something that happen. And then we saw this really nice effect. So this is the favourite part of the whole study, really. So if I talk you through this, down the bottom here we've got the story about the illegal no posters, and then the story about the illegal yes posters. So what you're seeing is for the illegal no posters, yes voters more likely to remember that happening, and for the illegal yes posters, no voters more likely to remember. And what's really nice is that it didn't matter how we broke it up. So when we analysed just the specific memories, there was this effect. When we analysed whether or not people remembered it happening, kind of collapsing it down, there was that effect. And when we included beliefs, it was the same effect. So it actually didn't matter how we quantified these false memories. This effect of political orientation was there regardless. And something I hadn't noticed, but Becky pointed out when she looked at the graph, is that there's much more, the no poster is much more believable. The story about the no side in general was more widely believed. And so we did check this out, and it was nice. We were able to look at the people who said that they wouldn't vote. And these are people who rated having the same feelings of apathy about both the yes and the no side. They kind of didn't have as much skin in the game, and they were twice as likely to believe the no story as well. So the no story it maybe just resonated a bit more for the no campaign, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. It's about people believing about the other campaign. It doesn't really matter which one it is. And so people gave these long descriptions of how they felt. And just pulled out some of the ones that are interesting. So lots of people placed in a temporal setting. They said this was the time it happened. So I had my mind made up before this happened, but after this is when I was completely disinterested. So they placed it at a point in time which we didn't give them. Some people added in more detail. So I don't think anything happened and the posters shouldn't have been burned. We didn't say anything about burning. We did say destroyed, but people adding in kind of more detail, which is nice. People who just thought it was really funny when the other side did something wrong. And loads of these, which I found really funny. People went through these cognitive gymnastics to turn it into something good. So they said, I felt proud because they dealt with it well. About a story about their own campaign. So I know they took illegal money, but they didn't litter. A lot of that. So people remembering it, but twisting it in a way that maybe it wasn't so bad, but still falling for it. I hate showing tables, but I'm just going to get through this quickly. So we did a regression that looked at factors that predicted whether or not people reported a memory for the poster story. And so these are all the individual factors and the interactions, but I'm just going to point out a couple of things. So, as we just mentioned, significant effect of ideological congruency. So if you saw something in line with your beliefs, you're much more likely to remember it than if it's something not in line with your beliefs. Significant effect of true memory count, and people, could get a score of between 0 and 4 for true memories. What you find is that for every 1 point increase in that scale, people were 2.12 times more likely to remember the fabricated story. And then what's interesting is there's this interaction between ideological congruency and cognitive ability. So there's no main effect of cognitive ability. So it wasn't just that in general people lower in cognitive ability did worse. That wasn't the effect. What we saw was this interaction effect. And so we found it in a regression, but it's impossible to graph regression interaction effects. So this is just a median split to kind of show you what's happening. And basically, you've got the high cognitive ability group in the solid bar, and you've got the lower cognitive ability group in the stripy bar. And so it's the same as the graph that you saw a while ago. So if you see for the higher cognitive ability group, you've got this effect where the no voters are more likely to remember the yes poster scandal, and vice versa for the other side. But then if you look at the low cognitive ability group, you'll see they've got exactly the same effect, it's just stronger. And that's what the interaction really is. And something I think that's worth pointing out is that there's no difference in how they feel about their own campaign. It's how they feel about the other campaign. So those two green bars are the same, those two pink bars are the same, but it's the other one. It's the pink and the green over there. So people are much more likely to fall for negative information about the other campaign when they have lower cognitive ability. Is kind of the main effect there. And then, if you remember, we got so much data from these people, we asked them to identify the fabricated stories. We said, you might have seen some big news, can you pick out anything that you think is fake? And I mean, as you would expect, the fabricated stories were identified as false twice as often as the true ones, which they should have been because they were. But mostly people selected the stories that they just earlier said they didn't remember. That's kind of what most people were going off. They just said, I didn't remember this, so I'll pick that. So what we were more interested in was the people who earlier said, I remember it. Once we raised their suspicions and said there could be fake news, do they take it back? Was kind of what we were interested in. And just 30% did. So 70% still persisted in saying, well, that one's not fake. And most of them picked a different story, usually a true story that they thought was fake. So it's a good sign that at least for 70% of these people, their false memory was robust enough that even when we raised their suspicions, we said, have a think about it, think through each of these, do you think any of them is fake? They still persisted in thinking that that one wasn't fake. And so again, regression that I won't go through in too much detail, but all the same factors, but this time looking at their ability to select it as fake. And you see the same factors coming through as significant. So for ideological congruency, when people saw a story that was in line with their beliefs, they were 90% less likely to be able to identify it as fake. So exactly what we would predict would happen, but quite a strong effect. Again, same effect of true memory count, but what's interesting is that it goes in the opposite direction. So if you remember, in terms of falling for fake news, people who knew a lot about the topic were more likely to form a false memory to begin with. That's what we found in the last regression. In this, it's the opposite. So people who know a lot about the topic are much better at picking out the fake story than afterwards. And Kira found this in her study too, it's not a fluke. So the idea is that maybe when you've got all this information about a topic, your kind of gut instinct of like, yeah, I remember that kind of gets biased. But then once you ask people to slow down and kind of engage and really be a bit more analytic, they can use all their subject knowledge to really kind of tease it apart and be able to figure out which one is fake. So it's interesting because it goes in the opposite direction. And for us too, we took this as good evidence that we had a reviewer for the other paper say that the relationship between true memory count and false memory count, maybe that's just people who like ticking yes. The kind of person who's going to say, yeah, I remember that to one, is going to say, yeah, I remember it to the other, and that's a fair point. But this kind of goes against that. So if it is just people randomly ticking things, having a higher true memory count wouldn't make you better at then later on identifying it. So it kind of goes against that idea that it's just a response bias effect. And then the same interaction between ideological congruency and cognitive ability. So again, those with lower cognitive ability were worse again. They had a stronger political orientation effect when they were asked to pick out the fake stories. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the other studies once we can finish this. So what we can conclude is that people are liable to form rich, detailed false memories about political events that never happened. I think it's worth pointing out we used a very simple method here. So it was just a picture with 3 lines of text. It's not much at all. Like, we could have doctored photos, we could have made doctored videos. I think we would have gotten even more. This was a very, very simple kind of manipulation. What we didn't look at, obviously, because we couldn't leave people with the false memories, we had to debrief them. We couldn't look at the behavioural effects. We don't know. It seems likely that implanting these false memories, if you can leave people with them, that it might change how they feel about the campaign and then might change the way that they vote. So all of that studies and other ones that show you implant a memory of getting sick from eating strawberry ice cream and then you don't want to eat strawberry ice cream. There's good evidence that these false memories translate to behaviour, which is kind of worrying consequences maybe when you think about political misinformation and things like that. And so, in particular, you're liable to form a political false memory, this study suggests, if the event is in line with your beliefs, if you know a lot about the subject, and if you have lower cognitive ability. I think for me, this kind of reminds me a bit of just social media. So, if you think, when you click on Facebook, you're likely to see things that are in line with your beliefs, and about topics that you know a lot about. That's exactly what you're going to see, because we all have these curated echo chambers that we use when we go on social media. And I think just one other thing that's worth pointing out would be the effect of exposure. So we only show people these stories once, but typically, when you're on Facebook, you see the same stories again and again and again. And that's even more problematic. So just to briefly show you this, because I think this is a great study. And this came out this year, and the illusory truth effect is this thing where if you just keep seeing something over and over again, you start to believe it's true, the more often you see it. And so this was a study where they showed people quite demonstrably fake stories. So stories of very low believability, like that Mike Pence said that gay conversion therapy saved his marriage. And they showed people these stories, and they either saw it like this, or they saw it like this, but with a warning down the bottom that said this has been disputed by third-party fact checkers. And they were inspired to do this because Facebook rolled this out, I think maybe without any social science testing. They rolled this out as a solution to fake news. They said, we'll just put warnings on things and say this didn't happen and it will help people. And so they decided to test this in this study. So people either saw it like this or like this, and they rated how believable it was. And it started out very low believability. People didn't really believe this was true. And so what you see, if you look at it here, the difference, so the blue bar is the first time they saw it, how believable they thought it was. The red bar is the second time they saw it. And what you generally see is just seeing it again makes people believe it more, and the warning really had no impact on that effect. So the warning made people believe it less to begin with, but then they still increased it the more they saw it. So even starting from a very low baseline, seeing things again and again and again increases believability. And they did another study that looked at it a third time, and you see the slope just extending. So I think it's worth considering this. So this wasn't from the perspective of memory, this was very much about belief. and whether or not you think things are true. But I think it dovetails quite nicely with what we did, in that we only looked at showing it to people once, but the more you see it, I think your memory of whether or not it actually happened or whether you've read this before, I think it's probably more of a memory issue, and it taps into what we did. And then just summing up, I thought I'd just show you some kind of cool stuff that so I mentioned it's a big project, and we've been following people up for a long, long time. So I'll maybe just show you this. So we had the 3,000 people who did the first one, and then a week after the referendum, some of these people continued on. They gave us their email address, they were nice. And we got another maybe 500-600 new people. And we asked them about their experience of when they heard about the result. We asked their flashbulb memories for the moment they heard about the exit poll. We quizzed them about different events that had happened in the campaign. We asked about their emotional reaction, how they voted, why they voted the way they did, loads and loads of questions, and we've just been following them up. And at each stage we get a bunch of new people so that we can rule out the impact of us just asking these questions over and over again and kind of isolate that out. So we're just sending out the next survey tomorrow. But we have some initial stuff. So the first, which you might find interesting if you were engaged in the campaign, Linda Levine, who's on this project with us, did this study looking at voter well-being in the US during the 2016 election. And the common consensus is that things like political elections, they don't have a big impact on our happiness, is kind of the general assumption. And yet she found this huge effect. So they looked at whether people were Clinton supporters, Trump supporters, or people who thought they were just both terrible. And you see this real drop-off in happiness. This is people's general reported happiness, life satisfaction. They measure lots of different things, and then you see it takes a while for them to kind of come back up and feel better. So big impact on people's well-being, and we've been tracking the same thing, and it's nice, well, kind of, that the week before the vote, no voters are feeling really happy, yes voters feeling very, very sad, and angry. This measure is like scared, angry, sad. It's a composite measure of lots of different things. Then the week after the result, you get this obviously switch around in that the yes voters are feeling happy, the no voters are unhappy. What's interesting is they're both just returning to normal. So we've also been measuring their predicted emotions. They both predicted beforehand that if their side won, they were going to be deliriously happy for a year, and if they lost, they'd be miserable. And so the predictions are like this, whereas the actual emotions they're just coming back to baseline, and people didn't really predict that. So we're also going to be measuring their remembered emotions and see if their memory is biased too of what they found. And then very briefly, we've been measuring their flashbulb memories. And you'll know other flashbulb memory studies on things like 9/11, people continue to report high confidence in the memory even though it's not very accurate. So we've been asking people if they heard about the exit poll first. If you remember, the exit poll came out on the Friday night, and that was kind of a big moment for a lot of people. They read the exit poll or they saw it on RTE, whereas some people heard about the referendum result the next day. So we've broken them up, and then we've been asking them questions like, where were you, what were you doing, where did you hear the news, who did you speak to, and then rate kind of how accurate it is. So it's a good way of tracking people's memories. And just as an example, they're really funny. So we've been having a bit of a laugh going through them as they come in, because this one participant who a week after the vote said, I was at home, I was doing some building work, I heard it on the internet, and I spoke to my wife. And rated the accuracy at a 9 out of 9, and the vividness and how clear and like a photograph it is. That's kind of the flashbulbiness of the memory as a 5. And then we followed him up, and he said he was in the car, he was driving, heard it on the radio, spoke to his daughter, now a 9 out of 9 and a 9 out of 9. And this is anecdotal, but there's tons like this, and some of them are hyper specific. So driving from Dublin to Cork, and this was a couple of days after, so like this is probably pretty accurate. Again, a 7 and a 7. And 3 months later, I was at a football match, and I spoke to the person next to me. So we're seeing these big shifts, and I think it all just ties into everything Beth was talking about last night about just the unreliability of memory and people's assumptions. So we're still kind of unpacking lots of this data and coding it as we go along, but in general, what you're seeing here is the vividness and the accuracy ratings that people are giving us are going down from 0.1 to 0.2 in general, but just not enough, because their consistency is really dropping off. And this was just the 3-month follow-up, so we're going to have 6 months and then 12 months and track how this goes. And then we're unpacking this by whether their side won, whether their side lost, whether they canvassed, whether they felt their own healthcare was going to be impacted by this vote, whether or not they'd ever had an abortion. We've tons of things to unpack. Yeah, what's worrying amount of things. And then the very last thing is we're looking at whether, because I think this is cool, we're looking at if people can remember why they voted the way they did. So typically, so this is a study by Beth as well, where they ask people if they can remember the reasons why they bought a specific CD. So they just tracked people for a year and said, at the start of the year they said, what's the last CD you bought, tell us why. And they give all the reasons that they bought the CD, and then follow them up over a year and ask them again, why did you buy the CD? And people add in new reasons, they replace the old reasons, they leave ones out, things like that. And we've been looking at that as well to see if people can actually give a consistent response across time, and they can't. So we only just started analysing the data. It seems about 30% of people, it's about a third are consistent, a third add in some new ones, and a third give us completely different ones each time we ask them. So lots of people adding things like the church. So I voted because of the Catholic Church, and then later it's all about choice. So people give very, very different reasons when you ask them, and particularly at the first time, people mention the campaigns a lot. So maybe when they were kind of in the mud during the referendum, people said, you know, I hated the no campaign, that's why I voted, or I liked the yes campaign, that's why I voted this way. And then later they became kind of more general, sort of abstract reasons that people voted. So loads more data to come on this once we analyse it, all of it that's coming in. So thanks very much, and thanks to everyone who's on this project, including Judy.
If anyone wanted to volunteer to help code some of this data, that would be amazing.
So much data to be coded. So happy to chat or have any questions.
I have a question for you, because I looking at that flashbulb result, since you're much more closely familiar with the other flashbulb studies, that is a really short period of time for such a dramatic change.
Yeah.
I thought that many of the others are a year or 2 years or whatever, they're coming back to you. So it teaches us that the changes are happening a lot quicker than we might have suspected from the published work on flashbulb memories.
I think a lot of those big ones, like the 10-year 9/11 follow-up one, I think in general they found the biggest changes were in the first year, and then it kind of crystallized a bit. Whatever the memory was at the end of the year, it tended
that's
to
what they
stay
stuck
there.
with.
Yeah. But it'll be interesting to see if that's what we find, because we're checking in with them. We felt there wasn't a point in going beyond 12 months, because so many of them show that they just don't really move after a year. It's kind of more interesting to look within the 12 months.
Yeah, there was something like it wasn't like well, the accuracy leveled off after a year, but also the actual content of the memory pretty much stabilised and stayed.
Nearly word for word, I think people. Yeah.
It's like you've got your story now, and that's the story.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting because people gave us long response. Lots of people named their friends. Like I was in the bar with Mary O'Reilly and blah blah blah. Like they gave us like a GDPR issue. The data. It's funny. Or I was at like number 12 Grafton Street. Like weird. Like very specific. They are getting shorter the longer.
But other people also gave annoyingly vague answers, like I was out.
Yeah. Great. We need to make that a separate code. So it's hard. We actually worried that we wouldn't get much of an effect here because so many people went home to their parents' houses to vote. There was, I'd say 70% were like at home or watching RT, and we thought there's not going to be any variance. But then the amount of people who said, because one guy said I was at home watching it on TV alone, and the next one he said he was at the beach with his girlfriend. It was 11 PM at night that it came out. It was a nice night. We decided to go to the beach.
I don't even got the time. Like the person who said like. I was in the pub and like I heard it on my phone with my friends and we were all having drinks, and then said I heard it on Saturday morning while I was making breakfast.
Yeah, so big changes.
Do you think some of it is though, because you have two times, you have the time you hear the poll result and you have the time you hear the actual result. So do you know what I mean? Like that I have two memories of the time I realised, oh God, this is going to happen great, and the next day when this is confirmed. Do you know what I mean?
But we asked them we asked them first, where did you first hear? Did you first hear the exit poll, or did you hear the referendum, and then the questions diverged?
No, definitely. I just wondered.
I also think too. I thought too, because we talked about this a lot. If you remember, the exit poll came out at 11 PM Friday, and the actual result was about 6:30 on the Saturday. Me and Kira were like writing everything down, so we knew this is coming. A lot of people said breakfast on Saturday morning, which could actually be neither. If they told us do you know what I mean? So if they told us they watched it on RTE Friday night, even if they are thinking about the actual referendum result, they hardly heard that at Sunday morning. That'd be quite late then, you know, that most people heard it on the news, and it was 5, 6 around then. So saying Saturday morning is like, it's neither one or the other. So I'd be more inclined to believe it's just a memory problem than mixing up.
I definitely don't dispute that people have false memories. I participated in the study and I got loads of them wrong.
But I mean, there's also, you always have this question with things like how well are people actually reading the instructions they're giving them?
Yeah.
To what extent is it following through?
Yeah.
You know?
Just a quick one, you presented these unusual findings at the start, and then there was all these potential problems, and then you maybe sorted them. I'm wondering if you have a new perspective. Did the newer findings kind of help?
Yeah. Big time. So one of the other stories I didn't get a chance to show you in the marriage equality study was we told people, we said, remember the whole home to vote thing? We made a fake story that it had all been a load of hot air, and official records showed just 75 people actually travelled home. Everyone else was just tweeting about it. And so that was one of our things, and we thought this was great. Like, no people kind of believed that it was all young people trying to be trendy, and there was a lot of that. And we didn't find an effect with that one. But I also, looking back through the qualitative responses, people said things like, yes voters that give long emotional responses, like the fact that people care so much to come home is amazing, and people aren't reading the whole story. And so I think that's a big problem. I think some of our initial stories in the marriage equality one, I think they might have been compound events. I didn't think of them as that, but even the mural, I wonder how many people were just remembering that the mural existed. I think the poster story worked because it was simple.
Okay.
You know?
So specific changes to the way in which you presented the story, maybe?
Yeah, I think, and I also do think getting people to kind of maybe tapping into something that's been kind of long-term is better, but I have a student at the moment doing one on Me Too and memories for the Me Too movement, and we're showing them stories about like George Hook getting fired and stuff in the last year. And so that might answer some of these questions more, because that won't be something that's been present for such a long time.
I was only asking because I was thinking if you pull that thread, you could find some sort of potential solution to this, or ways to present information that is or isn't susceptible, or
yeah, it's hard. We've been talking about a way of something I'd be very interested in is finding a way of training people to resist this, and does just partaking in a study like this help you resist it? So that's another thing I didn't mention that we're following up with these people. There's two things. So we're going to make sure that the debrief worked. We're going to show them the stories again and see, because of that illusory truth effect, we're going to see if people who see the story again, will us telling them this is fake, will that allow them to accept that? We're going to do that. And another thing. We're also going to maybe give them some other fake news stories and see, having been through this, having learned this, does it help at all? I suspect it won't. I think if there is an effect, it's probably quite short term. But it would be nice if it was. Yeah.
Oh, and we also wanted to see, another follow-up one, we were going to see whether susceptibility to these fake news stuff is the same. Are people who are susceptible to this also susceptible to like misinformation, like that kind of stuff?
Yeah. And at the moment, between the flash bulb and the false memory, it's not a high correlation. So some of the same people who did both, not a strong correlation at all, which is interesting. Yeah.
Psychology is very good at producing very strong medium level standalone theories, but it's poor at integrating different theories. And I'm just wondering, is there any possibility, or do you see links between this misinformation research and, say, broader patterns like cognitive dissonance research and persuasion research generally? I mean, is it possible to integrate them all into one grand theory of
I
memory
think
persuasion?
the source monitoring framework is an interesting way of thinking about that, because I think it speaks to kind of nearly like laziness of thinking. The fact that like we have these well-worn paths, and when something fits into that path, we just kind of go with it. And so the people who did the illusory truth research there, they've been doing a lot of research on fake news and cognitive reasoning. And so they're not looking at memory, they're just looking at kind of whether people believe things. And they're giving them things like a cognitive reflective test and other measures. They give them measures of whether people endorse pseudo-profound statements. So they took Deepak Chopra tweets that don't really mean anything, a connection of, the manifestation of the spiritual is ever awakening, or like it's just words that sound like it might mean something, and people who endorse them tend to fall for fake news.
It does ring slightly a cognitive dissonance of people who people want to have a coherent story about their lives and their
I think there's a way of all of these things coming together.
If you give them a piece of dissonant information, they have to try to work that in somehow, either reject it or else build it into their...
Or more than accept it if it fits in nicely. I think they all kind of feed together, and I think it's becoming ever more important with misinformation and fake news, and I think it's different perspectives. Some of these kind of people doing this work are kind of like economists, so people who study even some evolutionary psychology groups that are looking at group differences. I think it's a lot of people coming at a problem. So maybe in a year or two we'll solve it all.
There's a nice kind of cognitive dissonance thing because we asked people about to remember how they felt at the time, their emotional reactions. And we found that like the yes voters, when we asked them at 3 months, they're pretty much, their memories were pretty much stable. But the no voters after 3 months remembered having been less emotional at the time.
And that it was less important to them. So they're showing like, we keep asking them, we asked them the week before, the week after, and so on, how important was this referendum to you? And the people who lost are saying it wasn't that important. And these kind of things that are like, I suppose ultimately I'm glad for the people who need these rights, though I voted not to give it to them. There's an element of that. I think the qualitative stuff would be great to unpack. We're looking at some machine learning or something that could take all of this qualitative data and do some more with it, because it's so hard to, well, I won't be doing machine learning stuff, but it's so hard to code it all, and some of this gets very subjective, so it would be nice, but we'll see. Yeah?
I was just wondering about like social normativity in subject responses, and it came to my mind during Elizabeth's talk yesterday as well. Like how likely it is that people respond honestly in certain situations. I don't know, like you heard the news first when you were, I don't know, in a situation which you don't really want to share, or like what Elizabeth was talking about yesterday, like it is fine to recall a memory that I got lost in the mall because it's kind of a socially accepted thing that could possibly happen to people. But it's more embarrassing to recall a memory where I committed a crime and the police was called and stuff like that, and here as well.
I think I would think with some of those questions, it's an issue of converging research. So I think one study will have one problem there, and then the other study solves that. I think collectively, I would argue it's not just a desirability effect. So the example here is that if you think of people just trying to appear smart and trying to appear, this is an important social issue, they want to seem informed, they've just told us they care about abortion and all this, and then they want to say, of course I remember this. There's an element of that. But what we did was, we asked them first of all, do you remember it? And you could argue there we're incentivizing them to say, yes, I do remember it. Then we said, can you pick out the ones that are fake? And in that instance, we're incentivizing them, if you're so smart, you can pick it out. And people still struggled. So I think by flipping those two things, the incentive changes, if you know what I mean. And likewise, there are some studies where they get people to remember cheating on a test and committing crimes, and they're about the same rates as people doing kind of good things. Once you look at all the studies together, I think it's probably just more of a memory issue, but I think each individual study probably has its own problems. We did have one person too who, it's literally one person, so we don't know if there'll be anything like this in the rest of the follow-up, but there was one woman who told us that she voted yes, and told us that when we asked why did you vote yes, she said, actually I felt hugely pressured into it. I felt like I couldn't say anything about the no side without being labelled as backwards and blah blah blah. Give a whole thing. Rated high guilt about her voting choice and high regret. And then in the 3-month follow-up, she told us she voted no. And she said, I'm so glad I followed my conscience, I didn't bow to pressure. And she rated her pride as really high and her guilt and regret as really low. It's literally one person. But I mean, we're also keeping an eye on whether or not, I think even changing the reasons why you voted, all of that, I think it's maybe less to do with pleasing us than people's perception of themselves. And a kind of cognitive dissonance thing. But it would be nice if people forgot how they voted. It would be cool, but I wouldn't expect many of them.
Also in terms of pleasing us, that like pretty much everybody thought that we were shells for the other side. So
yeah, and even with that, there's even people telling us their reasons for voting over time. They know they're in this study and they know they answered this question 3 months ago. And if anything, you look a bit silly if you keep giving us a different story. I think if anything, we're incentivizing them to be correct. Rather than, there are lots of studies that show, I think, I've forgotten the exact number, but something like 80% of Americans say they voted for Barack Obama, when obviously they didn't. It's impossible. And people often take that as just a social desirability thing, that you don't want to admit that you didn't vote for him. Whereas what's quite interesting here is that there's no point in lying. There's no point in lying to us about something you did or you didn't. We have it on record. And so that suggests maybe it's a memory issue, which would be nice to unpack. Maybe.
Well, how many were like that anecdote? Because I think you would have expected more people to switch.
From yes to no.
no, from
No,
no,
yes. From
Well, it's
no,
only been
yes.
3 months, and again, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But that would be very strong evidence against that, I think, because I mean it's crazy. Like the idea that they would switch from a no to a yes to please us, like they look silly. So I think that would be good evidence if it happens. It's one person that we have so far, and we'll see what she says tomorrow when we send the next survey. If she gives the same answer. But even things like changing how important they said it was to them, we're going to ask them again. We asked them lots of questions at the start about how much they thought the 8th had impacted their lives, whether they canvassed for it, whether they informally canvassed, whether they tried to convince their friends, things like that. And so we can also track how they're going to change. We're going to ask them all those questions again. How much do you think this legislation is going to affect you? How much did you do for the campaign now that it was a success? So we can maybe unpack some of that, but we don't know yet. Yeah?
And just as you said, time is like obviously one of the most important factors in this study. Bearing in mind that it was like a Friday night in Ireland and a Saturday night in Ireland, and that the population is pretty much university students, is there any kind of like, I don't know, I'm just saying for example, more clarity after time than like if somebody was in a pub and they found out there's probably reasons to suspect that they were, you know, and if that with time they got more clear about actually what they, like instead of saying I was in a park when they were actually driving, like if they were driving but they actually remembered more or less, was there like an impact on the actual situation they were in?
The funny thing is, I think because so many people, so first of all, a decent chunk were students, but not most of them. So the average age was like 31. I actually think, because we did it with the journal, I think it was more like just maybe people in their 30s, that kind of way. And the bigger thing is that most people were at home or they were in their parents' house. It's a very common answer, that people went home to vote with their parents and then stayed in their parents and watched the Late Late Show. And people were like, there's tons of them, like I'm catching up with my brother, like loads and loads and loads of them. So if anything, we thought they would just be such dull memories that they wouldn't change. That's quite a bit boring evening. And so I think it's more that. In terms of it changing over time, I mean, there's no way of us knowing if it changes as to whether it's changing to something more accurate. You know, there's no way, all we have is their first response and assuming that that is correct. We do also ask them things like how much you talk to your family and friends about the referendum since, and how much you've been kind of reliving it and talking about it and things like that. It had a small impact in the initial regression that we did, I think. The biggest predictor of people's flashbulb memories was their event memory. So we asked them lots of questions like which county voted no, what was the percentage turnout, all those kind of questions. And that's what you find in the 9/11 studies as well. The more people kind of just know about the event, the better their memories tend to be.
Media was a big predictor.
Yeah, the big ones. How much media they've been reading about it since, which I think probably more speaks to how important it was to them. More than anything else. You know, it's really important to you, you're reading about it a lot, and you probably have a clearer first memory to start with, but we don't really know.
Do you plan on following up with your participants the week or around the time that women can access this care in Ireland?
I hadn't thought about it because these people are plagued. I don't know why anyone is answering my survey anymore. You only sent out the reminder on politics that I'm mortified asking them again. We hadn't planned on it. One thing we had planned on is maybe getting a subset of these people to do some more memory tests for us. So we're going to give them like an eyewitness test, misinformation, a DRM paradigm, a few things so we can look at them across multiple paradigms, maybe all on the same topic, all of it related to politics or abortion or something like that. It might be interesting to see how things change. I have a feeling once it's actually introduced, it'll just be kind of a quiet, it'll be like an item on the 6-1 and then...
I just think it might be interesting from an emotional point of view where around the time we were reading a lot about, I'm so happy this is passed, but it's actually really sad that it took us this long, and it's really sad that this is now happening in Ireland. And, you know, like that it might be interesting from looking at their emotions.
Yeah, and maybe even a bit of a bump, because presumably when it's introduced, I can picture the segment on the 6-1 that's like showing the day the referendum was passed on a campaign. There'll be a lot of reliving of it, but maybe quite short term. Imagine it'll just be a day or two, and then unless the bill drags out.
If the legislation is passed in the next week or so, that's going to affect the 6-month follow.
I'm sending it out tomorrow, so it should be okay. I think we've so many things we're trying to. The plan was to get them tomorrow and then again in May, at the end of May, on the year anniversary. we have like, you know, they have a 1 in 3, there's 3 €100 vouchers that people I think are hanging in for these vouchers, or maybe just because they're interested. So we were really worried that we'd lose a lot of the no participants. We didn't have that many to start with. And what's been amazing is that every single study we've done, we've had 12% no voters. So the attrition is the exact same rate across both of them. I thought maybe they'd lose interest. I think the people that are in this are just very interested in the referendum, probably.
There's still the possibility that even just with a steady rate of attrition, though, we'll end up with not enough power by 12 months for the no voters. You know.
Yeah, we're just hoping they're going to stick it out for that €100 vouchers.
You know, we're still after 6 months, we'll still have 3 follow-up time points, so that's still...
Yeah, let's see what happens. Yeah, we can just rein it in and stop asking them so many questions. Okay, yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you very much.